As we begin talking about legs and feet, the first big idea that I want to make very, very clear is that when we're talking about just the legs themselves, the upper leg, the lower leg, the knee, essentially all the basic guidelines, rules, and steps that applied to the prepping and rigging of arms will also apply to the rigging of legs and feet. So we're not going to repeat a lot of just the basic stuff about creating simple FK and IK chains for limbs, because that's pretty much going to be exactly the same in dealing with the legs. The primary difference between the legs and the arms is how we treat the feet as opposed to the hands. Hands are a lot more complicated, they have to do a lot more stuff generally, and foot movement is generally much simpler. But unlike the hands, the feet have to deal with being the contact point for the body on the ground in most cases. So because of that relationship with the ground and gravity in particular, there's a very specific way we want to look at rigging up feet. And we'll get to that in a minute. But on its very, very most basic level, this is really just like rigging arms. So let's start with looking at the most basic kind of a leg rig here, and a rig where we rig the feet very much like we would rig hands. So we've got this hipster guy here, and we're going to focus in on rigging up one of his legs. Alright, as always, we're going to start by setting anchor points. Now let's take a minute and look at our foot construction here very quickly. We have the foot divided into two pieces, a heel piece and then a toe piece. And most of the time, unless you're going to do individual toes, most of the time you're really only going to need these two pieces, or of course we can puppet tool this. We'll look at that a little bit later. But in terms of anatomy, basically about 2/3 of the foot, the ankle up to the ball of the foot in front and the heel, do not move or flex. Of course, there is some small stretching and squashing that happens in a real human or animal foot. It's part of the reason why it's set up with a lot of little bones so it can absorb impact and weight shifts. But have a look at your own foot. You can wiggle your toes, you can bend your toes up and down off of that kind of knuckle joint. The back part of your foot really doesn't move aside from just muscles and tissue squishing and squashing around on the bones a little bit. So for this very first, very simple rig we're going to build, we're going to attach these anchor points just kind of where you think they're going to be. We're going to put the anchor point for the heel here at the ankle, and the anchor point for the toe right at the ball of the foot there. And now we're going to parent this up just how you would think. The toe to the heel to the lower leg to the upper leg. And now, just as if this was an arm, we're going to create our controller at the ankle joint. It would be the wrist if it were a hand, of course, but we want that controller at the ankle for our leg and foot rigs. So let's go ahead and add that controller with the controller button, rename, resize, and position it. And let's go ahead and set up our IK. And our three layers for our IK chain are the heel, the lower leg, and the upper leg. So let's go ahead and select those and the controller. And we want 2-layer IK with goal. And now that we have our IK chain working, let's go ahead and add a control for that toe, just as if we were adding a control for the fingers. I'm going to lock that control window, open the toe rotation property, option click, tie that in. And now we can bend that toe. So we have a very nice simple rig here, a simple jointed rig. We can pick up and move the foot around, but also, and perhaps equally important, once we get this rigged into the body, when we click and drag on the pelvis or torso or center of gravity control, The foot stays on the ground as the body moves around. And this is where the advantages of IK really become glaringly apparent, that being able to lift the foot up and have it not move the body, or move the body and have the foot stay on the ground, is an ideal situation for rigging a character that is supposed to be standing in gravity. Now this simple rig will work just fine, just rigging the leg as if it's a simple arm. And we do have the ability to pose the toe to get some additional posing in there as well. But if you've ever had to animate a walk cycle or any complex movement with the feet, there's a control that we're missing here that would really help us, and that's called a heel roll. What allows us to do is take a simple controller like an angle control, a slider, or even a click and drag controller, and lift the heel up off the ground, but have the ball of the feet, the toes, stay on the ground, and have the IK system react as it should. This allows the character to essentially go up on tiptoes or lift the back of the heel in a walk without having to reposition the Y value of the controller. And just as an example here, if I wanted this character to go up on tiptoes, I would have to create a little marker here to indicate where my ground plane was. And then I would rotate the foot, lift it up, straighten out the toe, and then I would have to position that just right so it looked like the heel was up off the ground. Now this works, but this is impossible to in between if you're trying to create a transition from the foot being flat on the ground to being up in this position. You would have to essentially keyframe every frame to get that position right. It would be a nightmare. So this is exactly where creating a heel roll becomes a really important part of the foot rigging process. But it requires a pretty substantially different way of setting up the feet layers, or the null objects in the case of a puppet tool rig. So let's take a look at that with his other foot. Alright, you can see that we've already got our anchor points in place for our upper and lower arm, so those are all ready to go. But we need to take a closer look at the heel and toe in order to set up our heel and toe roll. Right now, these anchor points are set up exactly as they were for the simple rigging situation we were looking at before. But in order to get the heel and toe roll to work, the heel part needs to have its anchor point in a different position. There is our heel part. And for it to rotate up off the ground the way we want it to, we need that anchor point to be here at the ball of the foot in exactly the same spot as the anchor point for the toe. So let's grab that heel and let's snap that anchor point onto that same position. So now if we rotate the heel, it lifts up off the ground in a natural way. And of course, as we already had it before, the toe is able to rotate off the end as well. Now with those all set, we're ready to set up our IK chain. But remember that the end of our IK chain needs to be at the ankle here. That's where the controller is going to be. That's where we want the end of that chain to be, is here at the ankle. But we've just set both the anchor points for our foot pieces down here at the ball of the foot. So what we have to do is this. We're going to have to create a null object, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock this ankle marker here. We need to create a null object right at the ankle. I'm just going to use the controller button to do this. But this is not going to be a controller. This null is actually going to stand in for the foot in our IK chain. It's going to allow us to rig up this leg with our two-layer IK with goal, but without actually engaging the artwork for the heel and toe yet. So let's go ahead and name this. And I'm just going to call it ankle to differentiate it from the heel here. And let's just keep shying these as we go, since most of these are already shied. And we're going to turn it blue to make it part of the group here. And we're simply going to parent this in again as if it is the foot, or a hand in the case of an arm, or whatever. It's the end of our IK chain. And then, of course, for our IK chain, we need a controller. But here's the next little trick. This controller we're going to make will not be the actual click and drag controller that is part of the final interface. We need to create a controller in order to build our IK chain. But we're going to make a special controller in order to move the feet, but also allow the heel to actually drive the IK chain when we lift it up. Because when we lift up the heel, we expect the leg to move with it. So just like we have a fake ankle null, we're going to create a fake controller null just to build our IK chain. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit the controller button, and let's take this off of the top here and click and drag it back down and put it with our group here. And let's go ahead and name it. So I just named this the leg IK control because that's what it's going to be. It's not going to be the actual controller the animator uses, but it is an IK controller in this little chain. So we're going to color this blue, of course, and let's resize it a little since it's a little bigger than it needs to be. And now let's go ahead and build our IK chain. Ankle, lower leg, upper leg, and controller. 2-layer IK with goal. So now we have our leg rigged up with a null placeholder for the foot and a null controller that will later be hidden. Now the last thing we need to do is create the actual controller that the animator will actually use, and then we can hook this all up. Okay, let's get this all hooked up. We need to unlock our effects control here. I always forget that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take this leg IK control that we created earlier, and we're going to parent this to the heel. Because when we rotate the heel, we want it to lift and move that IK system. But remember, we also want to be able to click on this controller and pick up and move the whole foot all together. So we're going to parent that heel and toe that share the same anchor point. Let's remember, we're going to parent those to that right foot controller we just created. So because the IK controller for the leg is parented to the heel, and the heel is parented to our main controller, when we pick that controller up, it moves the foot pieces and it brings the IK along with it. And as we already discussed, we can now independently rotate the heel and have that also drive that IK, and we still have our individual control over our toe, which we had even with the first rig. Now let's add a couple angle controls to drive the heel and the toe roll. So I'm going to go up under Effect and add an angle control, and we'll just duplicate that to make 2. And we'll call this one heel roll. Oops, and we want to identify right or left, the R heel roll and R toe roll. Okay, let's go ahead and lock our effect control window, and let's go ahead and connect these up. So we'll option click on this rotation for the toe and for the heel, and we'll tie that into those angle controls. And now we can roll that heel and roll that toe from the main controller. But we've got one last thing that we want to talk about here. We've got some cleanup to do, obviously, but we also don't have all of our other IK controls, our auto stretch, and maybe more importantly, our IK orientation. Remember that all of that was placed on the kind of quote-unquote fake IK controller that we created when we built our leg rig. So there it all is there. So there's a couple ways you can deal with this. If you want all of the controls, you can literally just select all of these, Command copy, and then go to the right foot controller and command paste, and you'll paste all of those controllers in. And then you're going to lock your effect control window, scroll down to the effects on the original IK controller, and tie each one by one, to the corresponding effect on the actual visible foot controller using the expressions pick whip. So you do the IK orientation to the IK orientation, each of the FKs to each of the FKs, the stretch to each of the stretches, and just one by one just tie those all together. But the truth is that for leg rigs, quite honestly, we rarely need all of these controls. So I'm going to go back here, and the only thing that I'm really concerned about in this case, this is a jointed rig, so I don't care about any of the stretch controls, and I never really turn my goal on and off. That's pretty rare. But I might want to reverse the orientation of the IK. Again, that's also somewhat more rare when it comes to legs, because the leg can't twist the way the arm can. But it still would be good to have that control available. So since I'm not copying and pasting all of the controls, I'm just going to add a really simple checkbox control here. And we'll just call it right IK orientation. And by the way, this was the old name for switching the IK orientation in Duik. They've changed it now. It's a little more obscure, and it talks about clockwise and counterclockwise, which is all fine. But generally, when I have to set this up myself, I generally just call it IK orientation. I'm going to drag that to the top here. And then again, we have our effects window locked. I'm going to come down, just grab that IK orientation control, option click and drag to pick that up, and now this checkbox will now change the IK orientation. And again, let's remember, you can do that with all of these controls if you want. You just have to either copy and paste them or recreate them here and just tie the ones you want together with expressions. All we have to do now is clean this up to finish up our nice little leg and foot rig. All right, now that we've looked at a simple jointed example, let's take a look at some examples using the puppet tool. Now we will look at a 100% puppet tooled leg from the hip all the way down to the toes. But just like with the hands, in fact even a little more so than the hands, you're definitely going to run into some issues with your starching and with counter movements and bends in your rig when you try to rig a 100% puppet tool. Because the feet are almost always at a right angle to the leg, you're basically rigging the puppet tool bent and then asking it to straighten the artwork when you want to point the toe by rotating the entire foot. The puppet tool doesn't do a very good job of straightening things that started out bent. That's part of the reason why you want to try to pose your figure with the arms and legs straight whenever possible. So generally, I don't recommend 100% puppet tooled rigs for legs with the feet included in the mesh, either from hip to toe or knee to toe. But there will be cases where there's no other good option or where it is clearly the best option. And we will take a look at an example later. But before we do that, let's actually look at some combination rigs first, where we combine puppet tool elements with jointed elements. And just as a general rule, whenever possible, try to actually joint at the ankle. Because of the complications with puppet tooling, whenever that's possible, take advantage of it to give yourself the widest range of motion for your feet. So the first combination we're going to look at is on our orange woman here. And we've got a leg partially rigged up, and we're going to finish it. And what we've got for her is a puppet tooled leg with a jointed foot. So let's zoom in and take a look at what we've got. Okay, let's just take a look at the leg here for a minute. Now notice one little detail here. She's wearing boots, but as we divided her up for jointing, we made sure to have a circular overlap here at the ankle which meant that the top part of the boot had to be part of the leg. And you'd do the same thing if you had long gloves or gauntlets or something like that. But we've got this already set up with our IK controller that will be hidden once we're done with our rigging here. And just a little quick note about the starch. I only starched just a little ball at the top and a little ball at the bottom to hold those onto their circular overlaps when stretching. And other than that, we're just going to go without starch and just let there be nice soft bends on that leg. So that's all set up and ready to go. And we're going to joint the feet, which is a nice combination with a puppet tooled leg, because we can get the nice stretchy, bendy, soft curves on the leg, but we can keep the boot and the shoe nice and crisp. One of the big problems with puppet tooling the feet is it's hard to get them to stay firm and flat on the ground as things are moving around. But a jointed foot will stay nice and crisp no matter what's happening and give us a really wide range of motion, but we'll still get the nice soft bendy leg. Now before we hook this up, let's just note some of the very, very small differences between the previous rig and this one. And the main difference is this. Remember, in the previous rig, we had to actually create a null object called ankle in order to have the 3 layers to rig up for our IK. But in the case of a puppet tooled leg, we have to have a pin at the ankle for that puppet tool to work, to have something to rotate off of the knee. And when we add bones, it puts a null right at that ankle, which means we don't need to create a null here. The null is created in the puppet tool rigging process. So there is our ankle null there, and that was parented to the lower leg to the upper, and then we made the controller from that ankle, the controller right there, and then created our IK chain. Very, very simple. But essentially the same basic structure. And now the heel and toe are going to work in the same way. First thing we have to do is set those anchor points. So let's turn on our marker. Okay, with our marker on, let's zoom in, and we will snap each of these anchor points here to that center. And now that we've got that done, we can simply turn on our controller here. We already have a controller created here. And now we're ready to go ahead and hook this all up. So once again, we want to take the IK control, parent that to the heel. So again, when we rotate that heel, that activates that leg and that IK system. Then we're going to take the toe and the heel together, and we're going to parent those to our left foot controller. Since we know we want the IK orientation switch on our controller, let's go ahead and add that right away. And we also know we're going to want 2 angle controls for the heel and toe roll, so let's throw those on as well. Now let's lock our effects controls window. And let's start by hooking up that checkbox. So we're going to open the effects here on our actual leg IK control. And there's our IK orientation switch. So we're going to option click and tie that in with our pick whip. Then we're going to open these rotation values and tie each of these in to these angle controls. And now a quick cleanup to finish up this rig. Alright, this is a really nice, flexible rig, great for a really wide range of motion. A lot of cartoony action. We get a really nice range of motion off the bottom of this foot here. And of course, we have our heel and toe roll. Oops, almost forgot to zero out that foot controller. Let's zero that guy out. Now the next combination is honestly going to be a little bit more rare, but it gives us a chance to talk about a puppet-tooled foot rather than a jointed foot. So let's take a look at this hipster woman here. And we certainly could easily just joint her feet, but let's pretend that for whatever reason, maybe there's a lot of texture or whatever, that we need to puppet tool the foot. So let's zoom in and take a look at this situation. And the foot has been pre-composed, so it is one layer. And we've actually already put puppet pins on this. You'll see we've got one here at the ankle, one here at the ball of the foot, and then one at the tip in order to rotate this part of the foot off of that middle position. Now note that the anchor point for this artwork layer is also that center ball of the foot position. In fact, it sits right on top of the puppet pin that sits right there. As usual, we're going to parent the artwork into our chain. And because the nulls that occupy this position will be the nulls that drive the toe and the heel parts, we want the anchor point for the artwork to share their same anchor point here. Well, before we add the bones, one last thing I want to mention here. Notice that I've named the pin at the ankle. I've named it heel. Now the position is at the ankle, but what I am doing is naming the part of the body that that pin will drive. Now if that's confusing for you, you can name this ankle if you wish. It sometimes can get a little confusing in rigging whether you're talking about the body part, like for example a lower leg, or the knee, which is where the anchor point is, where the lower leg will swing. There's no right or wrong here. It's just about staying organized and clear in your own mind. And when I'm working with the puppet pins, I kind of try to basically name them based on what is being driven by them. So let's go ahead and add our bones and then hook this up. So with our bones in place, we've got one little issue we have to kind of deal with here, which is that when we had the two pieces of artwork, we had two rotation values right off this point, one to drive the toe and one to drive the heel. Right now, I can parent the toe tip to the toe here, and I can rotate that toe. But I also need to be able to rotate this heel from that same position. So we're going to need to make another null. So I'm just going to hit the controller button here, even though once again this is not going to be strictly a controller, it's just going to be an additional null in our little group here. Okay, let's temporarily unparent this, and we're going to go ahead and resize and rename these two nulls that are now occupying this same exact anchor point. Alright, so I renamed these both toe rot and heel rot for rotation. Toe rotation, heel rotation. I even made them both guide layers just so they sit neatly side by side here. And now we can set this up very much the same way we did when we had two separate pieces of artwork. So the toe tip, we parent to the toe rotation. The heel, we parent to the heel rotation. Now we also need to rig up the IK for our leg, and because we're rigging up the leg with jointed layers, we need an ankle null in order to complete the 3 layers for the chain. So we're going to use this heel pin that we've already got here and just hit the controller button, and now we can bring that down and put that into place. And let's resize that too. And let's rename that as well. And then let's also create a controller right there. Now this we're going to call our leg IK control. And let's get these all green like they're supposed to be. So we're going ankle, lower leg, upper leg, controller, 2-layer IK and goal. Let's just double check that's all working good. Yep. And let's create yet another controller, the actual controller that our animator will use. Alright, now that we've got our controller, we can parent this all up. Oops, we almost forgot to parent in our artwork. Let's parent our artwork to that heel rotation null. That's kind of our main null for the whole foot now. Then we parent the IK control of the leg also to that heel rotation null. The toe rotation and the heel rotation are parented to the right foot controller. And now we just need to add our controls for the heel and toe roll and the IK orientation. And a quick cleanup to finish up. So the same basic idea, the parenting structure is very much the same, just a couple of tiny little differences in how you set it up when the foot is puppet tooled and the leg is jointed. In the next video, we'll look at a 100% puppet tooled leg, one last combination leg, and an alternate control system for heel and toe rolls.